On February 24, 2022, President Vladimir Putin ordered Russian military forces to invade Ukraine, a neighboring country on the western border. It was originally contemplated by Vladimir Putin as a rapid military operation that should have been won over the weekend. However, his plans were a little short-sighted. Putin ended up dragging Russia into a full-scale war in Ukraine and pitted the democratic world against Russia. In this episode, we're going to explain the reasons why Putin started the invasion and how the world came closer to World War III than it has ever since the Caribbean crisis of the 1960s. For starters, let's talk a little bit about Ukraine. It's the second largest country in Europe by territory, with over 40 million people living there. Here's where it's located on the map. For nearly 70 years, Ukraine had been part of the Soviet Union and declared its independence in 1991, shortly before the collapse of the communist regime. This is where things get interesting. Historically, Western Ukraine and a large portion of central Ukraine have had ties to Poland and other European countries. People there speak predominantly the Ukrainian language, identify as Ukrainians, and are looking to join the European Union. Eastern and southern Ukraine, on the other hand, have been pro-Russian since the Soviet era. People there identify as Russians, they speak Russian language, many of them have relatives in Russia, and they would rather stay as close to Mother Russia as possible. So Ukraine is somewhat divided. The two forces are pulling the country apart. But hey, every country has its own problems. Why would Putin care? For Putin, Ukraine has strategic importance. Here's why. The Ukrainian soil is Putin's shield against NATO. If you don't quite know what NATO is, just think of it as a large professional army with advanced weaponry and military bases all over Europe. The NATO army is sort of shared by the alliance members. Article number 5 of NATO treaties specifically mentions that an attack against one member state will be considered as an attack against them all. One for all and all for one. Since its inception in 1949, NATO has been enlarging, and its expansion accelerated in the late 90s and early 2000s. Here's the current NATO map, by the way. Let's zoom in. Aha! Turkey, Greece, Poland, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. See why Putin's concerned? NATO's been enlarging at Russia's western border. Putin's convinced that NATO's expansion poses a serious threat to Russia's sovereignty. Is he out of his mind? Well, let's look at the facts. Here's the thing. Russia's own military actions in the 90s and early 2000s, including the Abkhazian, Chechen, and South Ossetia wars, were the reasons why Central and Eastern European countries had joined NATO. They were merely looking for better security. Now, here's Putin's view on the situation. Let's imagine NATO throws away all of its doctrines, switches from defensive to offensive mode, and all of a sudden decides to attack Russia. This is a crazy scenario, but okay. Let's see. NATO would likely strike through Latvia and Estonia, right here. It's going to be an easy win for Putin. First of all, there's Belarus and Putin's friend, President Lukashenko, who could give Russia a helping hand, as NATO troops will be heading towards the Russian border. Secondly, the front line will be relatively small. Now, imagine Ukraine joining NATO and the attack coming through Estonia, Latvia, and Ukraine. That is a whole different story. It would be much harder for Russia to defend. The front line becomes huge. Also, consider this. Ukraine's got access to the Black Sea. And if Ukraine joins NATO, then NATO's fleet will be deployed right on the Russian border. Putin wants to ensure this scenario never unfolds, even hypothetically. Hence, Ukraine joining NATO is not an option for him. For many years, things have been going exactly the way Putin wanted them to go. But remember, that was plausible only for the pro-Russian regions of Ukraine in the east and south. It was not what the people in western and central Ukraine were hoping for. The tension in the country kept rising, and eventually in 2014, the revolution happened. Long story short, the pro-Russian government fled Ukraine and the pro-European forces took over. This was a major blow for Putin. In his mind, the worst-case scenario was already unfolding. 2 weeks after the revolution in Ukraine, Russian troops invaded the Crimea Peninsula, part of Ukraine's territory with access to the Black Sea. Establishing control over Crimea was a strategic move, keeping the NATO fleet away from Russia. Meanwhile, the divided Ukraine was living through the post-revolution shock. With the pro-European president, Petro Poroshenko, Ukraine slowly but surely started getting on a course of its European integration. People in the western and central Ukraine said, "Yay!" and those in the east and south said, "Nay." Tension inside the country reached its peak. Eventually, in May of 2014, Russian-backed separatist forces in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk regions, held referendums and proclaimed their independence from Ukraine. The referendums, though, were viewed as undemocratic by the international community. So, here's where we ended up in mid-2014. Crimea in the south was annexed by Russia. The pro-Russian parts of eastern Ukraine declared independence. The independence was fictional, though, quite the opposite. Those territories became dependent on financial, military, and political support from Russia. And then things slowed down for a few years. The conflict shifted to a slow-pacing phase, a stalemate. In 2019, Ukraine had its democratic elections. Petro Poroshenko was succeeded by another pro-Western president, Volodymyr Zelensky. He promised to Ukrainians he would accelerate the course of Ukraine's European integration. But in order to do that, he needed to come to terms with Putin, at least regarding the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and somehow stop the conflict. On the other side, Putin was losing patience. As soon as the conflict is over, they'll be seeking the EU integration and NATO membership. We shall see. In December of 2021, Moscow came out with an absurd ultimatum and threatened a military response if their demands were not met in full. So, what did Putin want? First, NATO was asked to withdraw forces from 14 countries in Eastern Europe and revert to its 1997 state. Well, obviously, none of the Eastern European countries were okay with that, considering what was happening in Ukraine. They would lose their protection. Second, NATO needed to guarantee that Ukraine would never ever join the alliance. Okay, the problem with this is that it's not NATO that decides who joins the alliance and who doesn't. It's the member countries that are making this decision, not NATO officials. So, the ultimatum was rejected. It's hard to imagine a situation where it would actually be accepted. The world stood still waiting for what would happen next. Of course, the ultimatum and the threat of military response could have been Putin's way of demonstrating the seriousness of his intentions. There was still at least some hope that Putin was bluffing. But this time, he wasn't. I've made the decision to start a special military operation in Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, after a massive buildup of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border had been completed, Putin commanded the start of a special military operation, which is just a nicer term than a war. The day one attack began with Russian forces launching missile and artillery attacks, striking key military facilities and critical infrastructure on Ukrainian territory. At that point, the invasion officially started. It is remarkable how fragile our world is, how easy it is to turn upside down. We all know that war is never an option and always a mistake. Always. This is the story of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is how it was.
Alright, if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss new episodes.